Farlost, created by John Miro.
32. CNC? Dina Rodriguez's tinny voice sounded in Arnell's ear. Toad is fueled and clear. You have a go for burn, Toad, Nav Officer Okoro called back. Arnell listened to the staticky feed in his helmet speaker, taking it all in as best he could as he waited for Taggart to complete his work. Pilot Rodriguez had been fast, he marveled. She'd refueled her EVA craft in less time than it took for him and Taggart to make it down to Cellar 2, stomachs in their throats for fear of what they'd find in that emergency station. His emotions were on hold now, overwhelmed to have found the crew of Cellar 2 safe. While he heard the tinny voices of other human beings in a centuries-old ship calling them for help. His fingers tightened around the mesh bag he held out for Taggart in his spacesuited hand. Too many highs and lows had him reeling. Plus, he really had to pee and wanted out of his suit before he did. Why that was so important after all the death and carnage he'd seen that day, Arnell had no idea. Taggart grunted, pushing down on the bent tube running along the wall with the long wrench. Just about. Got it. The bolt turned with an ear-splitting shriek. For a moment, Arnell wished he'd left his helmet visor down. Then he took the bolt from Taggart and pushed it inside the mesh bag at his spacesuited hip. Taggart's massive shoulders bunched and released as he shook out the strain of removing the seized bolts on the thick, armored tube in front of him. The security officer had seemed better, more with it, since they began their trek to Cellar 2. As soon as they'd briefed the crew in Cellar 1 and put them to work, in fact, his 1,000-yard stare had disappeared. Idle hands, they do suck, Taggart grumbled through his own open faceplate as he tugged sheared fiber optic cable out of the tube. He said it as if in response to something Arnell hadn't said. Okay, Arnell thought, so Taggart was still being a little creepy. How long? He asked. They'd opened access panels on either side of a fold in the tube. The walls had shifted, and the alloy tube had crimped, cutting off comms to Cellar 2. Other than that, Arnell thought, this tank, leading to the access hatch to Cellar 2, was in better shape than most of the ship. The air was good. There was no impact damage from the storm, and the ventilation was feeding warm air. He looked over at the door to Cellar 2. The airlock seal light flicked between red and green, indicating that it had been jammed shut when the tank's frame shifted. Dealing with the jammed door was just an annoyance after what he and Taggart had seen on the trip down. They'd crossed through completely airless tanks, using wireless comm units to notify the repair crews behind them, spent valuable minutes spraying patch foam into leaks the automated systems had missed, and all the while wondering if they'd find all their friends floating dead inside Cellar 2 when they got here. How's it look? He asked Taggart again, not too concerned by the man's silence. He went from reading Arnell's thoughts to missing direct orders in the span of a minute. With what HHL-6 was going through, and how useful even an erratic Taggart was proving, he wasn't going to complain. Taggart nodded. Just a quick throw of fiber and they'll be plugged back in. He was already tugging cabling and a tool from the side of his suit to make the repairs. Then they can join us in the land of the lost. Arnell kicked off and floated back to the airlock. He gripped the handhold beside the access panel and lifted the handset there, which ran on a dedicated channel to the inside. We'll have you online in 2 shakes, Green. Duty Officer Green's face was mottled red. He looked angry, but Villanueva recognized that as a poker face. He'd taken enough of the man's money over the years to know. Green's hand tightened around the headset of the airlock hardline. Faster than... He cut himself off before he blurted, light. The masses of people trapped in Cellar 2 gave the duty officer breathing room now, looking calmer after his and Taggart's arrival, but explaining things to the mob would be tricky, Arnell knew. Let them think they were right as rain behind a stuck door, for now, he thought. It's going to be a shock. Remind everybody we're in one piece, we got here under our own power, and there's no reason we can't get ourselves back. Is that true, sir? Green licked his lips, leaning into the small airlock window. We can get back. Villanueva kept his own face neutral and redirected the conversation. Remember the physicist, Beecham? We're stuck in a gravity well right now. He says we can't try FTL again until we clear it. He nodded his head toward Taggart. When this feed goes live, people are going to panic. Keep them calm. We'll get you out. We'll keep you alive. We're all going home. We clear? Green nodded. Knowing you're alive out there makes it easier. All things considered, Green flashed a weak grin. I'd rather be losing my chips to you than manning this post. Villanueva laughed sourly. Keep them from hurting themselves, Richard, and I'll spot you a stack of chips when this is over. Well, I've seen you play. That's the only way you'll leave the table up more than me. They traded dry chuckles before a bony hand closed over Duty Officer Green's shoulder and shoved him aside. A rail-thin man appeared in, of all things, a tailored-for-space business suit. Hascom's very own Chairman Goss. Arnell knew him to be a tough-as-nails businessman, eccentric as hell, but still sharp as a whip. Arnell stood straighter. The man tugged on the necktie velcroed to his shirt front, raising his chin imperiously as he did so. He was holding it together better than Burkov had, Arnell could see. Status update third, he barked into the receiver Green had surrendered. Where's Commander Dwyer? Arnell floated closer to the window again. Dead, sir, he said, his hand over his mouth to obscure the words. I'm acting as first under Security Chief Montaigne. Please keep what I'm about to tell you quiet for now, sir. Chairman Goss's eyes narrowed. What? He sputtered. But Arnell could see belief and acceptance in the old man's clear eyes. The old man accepted Dwyer's death as easily as he had the trauma of being bounced around in the cellar by the storm they'd just escaped. He switched up his questions. And is whatever is happening out there the reason, First Officer, you did not join us? Villanueva took a deep breath. Bill Yu didn't make it to the cellar, he thought to himself, feeling an extra sadness pile on his shoulders. Then Yu's most likely dead, sir. We've had serious casualties. The old man leaned forward, his fingers tensing around the hardline handset pressed to his ear. Moisture from his snarling mouth collected on the airlock window pane. What are we still doing in here? Why isn't there a whole shift here to open this door? Explain! Sir, what I'm going to tell you is difficult to hear. HHL-6 encountered a micrometeorite storm. The ship's in emergency condition, and the crew from Cellar 1 is in the midst of emergency repairs. There have been deaths. We'll assemble a team to get you out as soon as we can spare them. The ship's still bleeding air and hasn't been fully examined yet. Goss's manicured hand appeared in the window, brushing away Arnell's words. Yes, fine. Get on with it, Villanueva. The chairman turned to leave, accepting Villanueva's reality with trademark cold business acumen that he was known for. Testing signal, Taggart muttered by the wall. Arnell nodded and was about to hang up the headset when the chairman's voice blared from it. Get Burkov here. Arnell shook his head. Sorry, sir. Burkov became hysterical, and the commander had to restrain him in the CNC duty cabin. The folds of the skin around the old man's clear, sharp eyes folded into a narrow glare. She put a vice president of the corporation under house arrest. Signal solid, Taggart muttered behind him. Patching data through. Sir, Arnell told the chairman, forgetting Taggart's words, during the radiation storm that required you all to gather in the cellars, our course trajectory and acceleration were interfered with by multiple sizable impacts. We would have died if we stayed in place. We took extraordinary measures to relocate, and the vice president became hysterical. And we're live, Taggart said with a grunt of satisfaction. What the hell do you mean extraordinary measures? Goss said, his voice brittle and angry. And this nonsense about relocating, are you being smart with me, son? Villanueva bristled. Sir, this is a condition-red emergency. Commander Montaigne has shown great restraint with... His voice died out as, behind the chairman, he saw people crowd around the monitors and begin to gasp. Oh, shit, Arnell thought, only then realizing Taggart had already patched the cellar in. Taggart was standing beside him now, peering in as Goss turned to look at a small monitor displaying the Thorn and the spaceship graveyard. I'm sorry, Chairman Goss, I'm needed elsewhere. This was a formality, for the chairman was facing away, the handset forgotten as he stared at the screen like all the rest. A work team will arrive soon to assist with the door, he finished, and hung up the handset. Arnell fixed Duty Officer Green with a stare and nodded slowly. You know your duty, his body language said. Green nodded back, confirming that he did. What do you know? He's worried about the others, Taggart murmured, thinking of how to keep them calm. Arnell stared at his security officer as he bumped their shoulders together. Old Goss has a heart after all, a little stumpy one. Arnell just stared from Taggart to Goss and back, then shook his head. Can you do anything more here? Taggart laughed. Not if you want that door to close again. Otherwise, I have some explosive charges. Arnell snorted. Let's go. They kicked off. Arnell toyed with leaving Taggart behind, but it was an empty, symbolic gesture. HHL 6 needed all hands right now. He turned up the voices, whispering on his suit radio. The gruff one, Gruber, was talking again. Well, talking was a stretch, Arnell decided. He was spouting off numbers that Beecham would interrupt every few minutes. HHL 6 groaned around him, louder than usual, although the poor structure really hadn't stopped complaining since... He shook his head. I can't help CNC navigate the ship. I can't help Green manage Goss through the door in person any better than through a screen. He hated feeling useless. Racing back to CNC at least kept him in motion. He ran through a mental checklist of disaster planning, getting lost in the minutiae that he knew had earned him a reputation as a hard-ass and a stickler. Stickler, yeah, Taggart muttered. Don't think anybody respected you enough to call you a hard-ass before this. I sure didn't. Quit doing that, Arnell shouted, grasping a surface and pushing off, turning to face Taggart as he did. Am I talking out loud? Is the shock that bad? Taggart pushed off the same surface far more elegantly, following his first officer up to the next airlock junction with a thoughtful look on his face. No, sir. I guess maybe we're bonding. You got a lot more spine than I'd have guessed. Arnell laughed, his emotions still zigzagging and pushing against the freezer door he'd buried them behind in his psyche. Glad to hear I've made a friend, he said, happily embracing that sentiment over the eerie behavior he'd asked Taggart about. Taggart nodded, a meter behind, reaching inside his spacesuit's open visor to scratch at his chin. Yeah, you're solid. I can see what Ina saw in you. Arnell stared back, goggle-eyed. Was Taggart messing with his mind? Genuinely unbalanced by the terrors of the past day, or was his sense of humor truly twisted? He decided he didn't care, so long as Taggart was useful. Besides, he really did like Taggart, which was odd after all the demerits he'd assigned the security officer before. Arnell was shocked to learn just how much going through fire with the crew had put all that corporate citizenship bullshit he'd strived for years into perspective. He reached out to the closed airlock ahead. You're messing with my head, Taggart, but I guess I've got enough spine to put up with it. Taggart laughed. Arnell laughed too, bracing himself at the airlock and pushing himself to the side to make room for the younger man to land. After he did so, the younger man's dark face turned toward him. Upper teeth bit pink lower lip as he stared at Arnell. Sorry, sir, about Ina. His face tightened. How do I know that? I'm not trying to mess with you, sir, I'm not. Arnell sighed. We can worry about that later. First we plug all the holes and double-check all the plugs, yes? I don't want anyone else to die because we miss... Where the back of his suit pushed against the wall, a vibration came out. Subtle, irregular. It came out again. He spun and looked at the equipment locker he'd been bent against. He pressed his hand against it. This time he felt and heard the slam of something from the other side. He braced his feet below and twisted the manual release for the locker. He pushed the retractable door up. And out fell a man. A black worksuit with command patches on the shoulders tumbled into Arnell. He grabbed for the man to stop his tumble, then Taggart was there bracing them both. The figure in his arms was shuddering, his face huddled down against his shoulder, hiding from them. Arnell recognized the short hair, the wiry frame, all the same. Bill, he gasped. First Officer Bill Yu looked up when called. His eyes bugged out, His face was coated with tears. His entire body was racked with sobs. "All dead, all dead, all dead," he muttered, barely audibly. Bill Yu's eyes didn't register them. He stared all around, his motions jerky and bird-like. "Bill," Arnell said again, shaking the first officer by the shoulder softly. In response, Yu's face collapsed into a dry crying spasm. "Oh, man," Taggart whispered, his face drawn. "The lights. Everybody's dead." Arnell remembered his dream. He saw the same recognition of the words in Taggart's face. Too much was happening, too much for anyone to hold it all together. Calm, beloved Bill Yu had spent the whole time alone. Commanding, confident Bill Yu, who could order and receive happy obedience from anyone on board HHL-6, had waited for death, been visited by the lights, been left in the screaming bones of the ship he ran for Dwyer, all alone. "I've got you, Bill," Arnell told him, squeezing both biceps. Taggart grabbed on the back of his suit, holding him steady instinctively. "We've got you, Bill. You're safe." First Officer Yu shook his head over and over, his shoulders moving with his head, repeating the strange motion over and over. "No, not safe. No, not safe. No." Bill Yu was a cracked shell of a man. "We saw the lights, too," Taggart said. Bill kept up his weird, incessant head and shoulder shake, but his eyes met Taggart's. They widened even more, taking in the black man hovering behind Arnell. "The lights," Arnell started, then took a deep breath. Bill needed to know he wasn't mad. He said the words. "I saw something too, Bill. Something talked to me, through my wife. Told me not to let the lights die or we would die." Bill laughed. "No, not that," he tittered, high and shrill. Arnell nodded. "It's all right. We didn't die. The thing was talking about Beecham, his force field project. Light show?" Bill kept shaking his head in that way that felt wrong. "Not the toys in the lab," Bill squealed in a sing-song voice. Arnell suddenly wanted to take his hands off him. "No, no, no, not don't let the light show die." Bill's eyes focused on something far away. "Don't let the lights die." Arnell felt goose flesh bloom on his hands where they touched Bill, then spread all over his body. "Ugh!" Taggart barked, letting go of Yu's shoulder where he'd reached out to offer support. Bill Yu stopped shaking, looking right into Arnell's eyes now. "The lights are so scared," he repeated again, in a hiss. Arnell couldn't breathe. Instinctive fear rippled through him, fear of something that he couldn't understand. Yu collapsed in Arnell's arms. Taggart steadied them both. Bill Yu's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into Arnell's arms. He watched the man's lips move again, emitting a paper-thin whisper. "So scared, so scared."
Farlost. Music by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Learn more at servingworlds.com.
Hi, John Miro here. This month, Farlost is brought to you by Patreon backers like you and executive producer Tom Phoenix. Patronage starts at 25 cents a cliffhanger or $1 a month. Patreon.com. Thank you for your support.